Well, good evening, everyone. Who enjoyed your little traverse from home to here this evening? It's a beautiful moon, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. It's a super moon. And pardon me? Oh, the wolf moon. And then what happens later this month? Blue moon. Exactly. It's the blue moon. Right? So, for those of you I haven't had a chance to meet in the past, my name is Mike Shen. I'm a volunteer at the Historical Society. And Ben Neely is unfortunately ill. He came down with the dreaded illness from the school and over the holidays and whatnot. So I have the pleasure of introducing this evening's speakers, but then also giving you a brief preview in terms of what to expect in 2018. Woohoo! So 2018 is a very special year. How many people know why this is a very special year? Raise your hand.
Yeah.
Yes. Launching with the first presentation of the speaker series on the Historical Society itself. Augmented throughout the year with what we hope will be a tremendously diverse set of programming for the Historical Society. This is our inaugural event for bringing forward a new, fresh look at how we do our events, schedule our programs, where we meet, the topics. We hope that the year that is about to unfold will in fact be one that you'll remember in terms of really diverse and interesting engagements. We want these events to be very tactile, very experiential, and get on your shoes because we're going to be taking you across the county. So, but there'll be more about that a little later on. My job right now is to introduce tonight's speakers. And how many of you have heard of this guy called Tim Smith? Would you raise your hand? Okay, great. And then there's another fellow that's just been sort of skyrocketing on. His name is Andrew Dalton. You ever heard of him? Okay. Well, then it's super easy because my job then is to simply say, give a few stats that help you to help us put into perspective the wealth of knowledge and the depth that these two people bring to the table. So Tim began at the Historical Society before we were ever born. No, I'm joking. 1989. 1989, he walks in and says, I want to see this collection. And after that, it's been just a continuous sort of level of engagement, of contributions, and not only being a licensed battlefield guide, but also now being the collections manager at the Historical Society, author of books, and 10 books, in fact, and just an all-around incredible resource for anyone that walks through those doors. Andrew Dalton, I'm sure people here have read his book on the farm and the family. He first visited the Historical Society when he was in 8th grade. That was a couple of years back. He's now in college and will be moving onward, we anticipate. So with that, Andrew has also been an author and is really sort of pushing us at the Historical Society into becoming a much more adaptable and to the trends in the 21st century, bringing new techniques to the table and inspiring new people. So with that, I ask that Tim and Andrew come up for this evening's program.
Start? Yep.
A historical society is an organization dedicated to preserving, collecting, researching, and interpreting historical information or items. Originally, these societies were created as a way to help future generations understand their heritage. Historical societies vary in specialization, with focuses ranging from specific geological areas such as counties or towns, universities, railways, ethnic and religious groups, to genealogy, pioneer history, descendant groups, and to the preservation of antiques or historic buildings. It is said that historical societies originated in Western Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. The oldest historical society in the United States is in what we now call the Massachusetts Historical Society, which was founded by a group of Bostonians in 1791. Early historical societies were formed mostly in large cities and largely in New England. In many ways, Adams County was in the forefront of this movement. Many historical societies and organizations were formed about the time of the centennial in 1876, a time when people were looking back and feeling proud about the origins of the country and were anxious to highlight the role of their families or groups in this history. We'll go to that.
All right, so I know a lot of you have been involved with the Historical Society a lot longer than I have, so I'll apologize in advance if we get anything slightly incorrect over the course of this presentation. But I wanted to start with a quote from Dr. Glatfelter, who I had the pleasure of knowing for, I think, 2.5 years at the very end of his life, and I know some of you have known him for decades. But he wrote, I think in the early 1990s, in a county where local history is overshadowed by a great battle, the existence of a national park and cemetery, and the renowned wartime visit of Abraham Lincoln, it is understandable that a county historical society would have an uphill battle for support. And I think that really sums up what we still face in Gettysburg, having the battle, obviously, and the millions of people who visit Gettysburg, but maybe don't really understand the whole story of what we have to offer and how what we're trying to do is separate from that. Although it includes it, it is a unique story that spans the entire history of Adams County, not just the Civil War in 1863. So we wanted to start with just talking about earlier efforts before ACHS was established. In the local newspapers, there were historical columns as early as the 1870s that were running weekly or monthly, and they would cover a variety of topics: bridges in Adams County. There's some on the early founders of towns like Gettysburg and Biglerville and Abbottstown, and you'd have a variety of topics that were being covered. And actually, the editors of the newspapers themselves were writing some of these columns. Henry Staley in the Gettysburg Compiler was writing them, and then also more traditionally, people were recording their own family history as far back as we have records, and we see that in family Bibles, where people are writing births, marriages, and deaths very early on. We see it in letters where people are passing down their genealogy, perhaps to children and grandchildren. And we're lucky to preserve some of those things at the Society. And Tim and I marvel sometimes when we see that someone did their family tree in like 1860 and it goes back to 1750. Can you imagine if you had that today for your own family? So the first Adams County Historical Society, a lot of people do not know much about it, and including us, because there's very little documentation of it. But in 1888, a group of individuals got together, and it was they created the Constitution of the Historical Society of Adams County, Pennsylvania. And you can see some of the signatures are people who are very well known locally and nationally. This was spearheaded by Edward McPherson, who was a 2-term congressman. That's his picture. And we actually have his signature in the original minute book, which is really neat. McPherson was the first captain of Company K, 1st Pennsylvania Reserves, and he was also he was actually defeated in 1862 for his re-election in the House of Representatives, but after that was actually selected to be the clerk of the House of Representatives, and he served in that position from 1863 until 1875. And after that, he presided over the Republican National Convention in 1876. And between these periods of time, he would return to Gettysburg. I'm sure he lived in Washington for extended periods as well. But actually, he went back and did the clerk of the House job again in 1881 to 1883. And then again, he did it in 1889 to 91. And we just, in the last couple of weeks, have been realizing that that probably had to do with why this was such a short span of time that this society was active. Because he actually went back to Washington and was clerk of the House after basically spearheading this effort to have the first real society. But this organization did collect a very few donations of artifacts and books and pamphlets. We don't have any of them, unfortunately, that we know of still at the society because there was so much time before the current society was formed, so we don't know where some of those things ended up. But anyway, so that's a little bit of history on the very early part of it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that Edward McPherson, at one of the first meetings at the Historical Society, he presented a paper. And his paper was on the history of the creation of the county. Another guy on that list was a guy named Demarest. I think that's how you pronounce it.
Demarest.
Demarest, okay. He was a Presbyterian minister, and he wrote a pamphlet on the history of the Presbyterian churches in Adams County. And I think he wrote a specific history of the Presbyterian church, the Upper Marsh Creek, or the Gettysburg Presbyterian Church. But he also did Scotch-Irish in the area also. And these papers were presented at these meetings. Now, we do have copies of these booklets, but we do not know that they are the copies that stayed in the society from that time until the present. We always talk about that amongst, when we're in a society, what we have that may be the oldest thing in our collection. Of course, we have the minute book, but the minute book for this society was not given to our society until much later, right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So I should have mentioned on this list, at the very bottom, you see a signature you might recognize. David Wills was a member of the first Adams County Historical Society. And other people of note, Charles Beeler, Aaron Sheely, Daniel A. Skelly, and John L. Hill, Dr. John L. Hill, and also Edward S. Breidenbaugh, who was a professor at the college, and William Archibald McLean. So these are really some of the most prominent individuals in the town at the time doing this. Yeah. These are two articles from the first Historical Society. This first one, I think on your left, is the state librarian of Pennsylvania actually visited one of the meetings of the society and gave advice on how to preserve and protect local history, which was really a relatively new phenomenon, having these historical societies. As Tim said, they're coming about in the 1870s and 80s. But we also could mention that there were county histories written early on, and even all the way back to the 1840s, there were histories of Pennsylvania that had local history on all of the communities within the state. And on the right, that's another article about the meeting of the Historical Society that mentions Edward McPherson. And then there's kind of, and Tim can talk more about this after this slide, but there was a real push after this first society failed to have a historical society around the turn of the century. People were actually finding artifacts and donating them to the York County Historical Society, and that made people very angry in Adams County that we didn't actually have a place to have our own history preserved. And so this is kind of a call to action from someone in the local newspaper. At the end it says, "Let us have an Adams County Historical Society." So that's 1902. And oh, there you go. Yep. I don't know what Tim's doing. Okay. But yeah, so this, it also starts, the gift, there was a powder horn that was given to York County, and this person's really angry that powder horn wasn't kept here in Gettysburg. But I like the second paragraph. If Adams County was some obscure corner of the world where nothing had ever happened, it might not be surprising that these things with which its history are insolubly linked, I should say, I think, were apparently matters of little public concern. But when Gettysburg and Adams County represent the most important historical spots on the western continent, this unconcern seems remarkable. So there's someone very, very upset about the fact that we do not have a historical society. So let me just talk about half of this, and I think Tim had the other half. So the next real effort to have a historical society in Adams County began in 1934, and it was spearheaded by Charles E. Staley. And he was the son of Henry J. Staley, who I mentioned earlier. So his father was writing these local history columns, and then the son, when he's of age in the 1930s, I think he was more than of age. He was like 65, but which tends to be a trend with historical societies. But so in 1934, the second real Adams County Historical Society was created, and unfortunately, it lasted only 2 years this time because Staley died in 1936. So again, there was another gap. But this second effort was a much stronger effort than the first, and it really led to the creation of the present Adams County Historical Society, which began in 1939, and then the official charter was in 1940, which is what we celebrate as our real anniversary of the creation of the current society.
Now, you know, the newspapers Andrew mentioned really were the keepers of our local history for many years, and we're fortunate that the Historical Society has gained a collection. It was actually donated to us by the Times News and Publishing Corporation of all the early local papers. And so we can look back at these articles that were written. And Edward McPherson wrote a series of articles while he was the sort of part-time editor with David Baylor of the Star and Sentinel in the 1870s and 1880s. And of course, we had an individual in the county, J. Howard Wirt, that moved to Harrisburg, but he wrote a series of articles in the early 1900s on the history of Adams County. And these articles have survived, and we have these. And so the paper was sort of promoting an archival record of Adams County's history. But, you know, people wanted also there to be a place where things of historical interest could be on display, artifacts. And so the Adams County Historical Society formed again in the 1930s and then again in 1939, 1940. But still, there was no place where this stuff was held. And we're not sure how much of the 1930s collection of the Historical Society actually made it to us to the present day. There wasn't really an accession record, an inventory record of the holdings of the society. And currently, other places have that same issue. I think Emmitsburg, for instance, the last I am aware, they don't have a permanent home, and members of the society are the keepers of their artifacts that people have donated to them, which can sometimes be a problem. I just thought I'd mention, I made Andrew put this particular slide in it, that in 1940, I think it was late 1939, they first started talking about it. The Adams County Historical Society had an option to buy the Dobbin House. And yeah, if you read the article down there, for $3,000. So the Adams County Historical Society's headquarters was going to be the Dobbin House. I'm not exactly sure what happened. The option was up. Another person bought, a guy named Lippy, I believe, bought the Dobbin House, and he's the one who eventually put that diorama in the Dobbin House, if you remember that. But I'd imagine it wasn't the price of the building that scared the board of the Historical Society. It was probably the price tag associated with the renovations of the building to be used as some kind of functioning society that scared people off.
So this article marks the actual incorporation in 1940 of the society, and we still have the charter, the original, in our office. But so this is 1940, but still before we had a home for all the materials that had already been collected. We don't, again, like Tim said, we don't know whether these things were being stored in people's houses, but there was no actual facility until 1943 when we moved into the basement of the courthouse. And we were there until 1961. And there was a pretty substantial museum in the basement. It was 2 rooms and then it ultimately expanded to the entire basement floor. But this was really an effort led by Dr. Robert Fortenbaugh, who we're going to talk about in a minute. He was a professor at the college. Fortenbaugh was born in Harrisburg, and he graduated from Gettysburg College, actually in 1913, and then went back to teach, as many did. And as Dr. Glatfelter wrote about Fortenbaugh, it was he who began to organize the Society's initial library and museum collections. He began its first accession register in October of 1943 and made more than 3,000 entries between then and 1957. So he was really the original record keeper of the Society's holdings, and he organized the museum. with help from others that we're going to be talking about a little bit more. But this is a photo from around that time when the society was there. And as you can see from the article, there was a 24 by 17 foot space that was used as a museum. And
I don't know what's happening there. Wow, it
Did
went
you
back
want-
way back.
you want,
Okay.
here, this one's you.
Okay. That's crazy. Okay, so one thing interesting about 1943, when they did, I wanted to ask this question. I forgot I told you I was going to ask this question.
Oh, yeah.
How many people here visited the Adams County Historical Society while it was in the courthouse?
Wow.
Okay, you were a little slow. You didn't want to admit it at first, Dean. 4 people. And see, I told Andrew that we'd have people in the audience that had visited at that location.
Does anyone have photos? You want to?
Yeah, we do not have a photograph at all of the inside of the Adams County Historical Society while it was in the courthouse. We looked and looked. I thought it would be a simple matter. We do not have one. So if you can come across a photograph that shows inside of the facility, we'd be more than happy. I guess we're too busy recording other people's history and not our own at that time. I was telling Andrew that my first program for the Adams County Historical Society, and I have no idea when it was off the top of my head, maybe 1991, 1992, I spoke on the Gettysburg Electric Railway, the trolley. And at some point in the program, I asked if anybody in the audience had been on the trolley, and 2 people in the audience had ridden on the trolley. It ceased operation in 1916. So I knew we'd have some people that had been in the society, because it was active there until the late 1950s, early 1960s, I guess. So there are a lot of people that we could talk about in association with the early historical society effort. And, I wanted to include some people and, that were favorites of mine or unsung heroes. And, I didn't want to, I know that we're leaving a lot of people out, but really, as we go on here in the program, there are 3 separate things going on with the Historical Society. One of them is an archives and research room so that people can come to the location of the society and they can do their family genealogy or look up information on various historical topics within the county. And there are people that work there as volunteers to help people who are researching. The second thing is there is a monthly meeting, just like we have right here. And there are speakers at these monthly meetings, and members of the Historical Society or members of the public at large attend the meetings and hear lectures on local history, and the meetings promote different topics relating to local history. And the third thing is a collection of artifacts that is displayed either at the research room, when it was in the courthouse in a room, or in various locations around the county where, public libraries and cases in the Gettysburg College, or like, we have now at the Heritage Center, the Lutheran Seminary Museum. So these 3 entities sometimes are not closely related. Like the people that come to the meetings are not necessarily the people that attend the research facility and do genealogical research or are interested in the museum. So there's a lot of different people we could talk about. And early on, the Historical Society formed committees every year, and different people were part of these committees. But a couple people that I just wanted to mention in the early history are Dr. Henry Stewart and Elsie Singmaster. I'm sure most people are familiar with Elsie Singmaster, who was a voluminous writer and wrote hundreds, and I don't even know if we have a total. We have an Elsie Singmaster group that is working on it of stories and books that she wrote, but I'm sure it's hundreds. But she also took a great interest in local history, and it seems that she was very active in as the program chairman and helped to bring people to the society to speak on a monthly basis early on. And Dr. Henry Stewart, of course, his mother, Sally Myers Stewart, was a civilian during the battle that helped nurse the wounded, and Henry Stewart took a huge interest in local history, and he was much more active in the research phase at the research room. And if you visited the research room before he died in 1956, maybe you are familiar with Dr. Henry Stewart. And you know, at the Society today, we do have a large amount of stuff that he was him from his private collection or he generated for the local historical society. So both of these people, along with many others in their day, like Margaret McMillan, for instance, or Colonel Sheeds, Jacob Sheeds, who was the secretary of the Adams County Historical Society early on, took an active role in helping to formulate the society. And I should say at this point that early on, everyone is a volunteer. And, you know, we say it all the time, and it's not an exaggeration. We could not have run this society for as long as we have without a large amount of volunteer labor. So, you know, today we have paid employees, but at this point there was virtually no paid employees, but it's a massive undertaking to try to run one of these historical societies for the public, and it requires a lot of volunteer work.
So as I said, Dr. Fortenbaugh was a professor at the college and was probably the single most influential person involved with reestablishing the Historical Society and caring for the museum and collection in the 40s. And Fortenbaugh actually began the first accession ledger of all the donations that we were receiving. And actually one of his students, when he was a professor, who would later become a professor, was Charles Glatfelter. So this was Dr. G, as we'll call him, his mentor. And Fortenbaugh had a horrible heart attack, though, in 1958, and that prevented him from continuing any work that he was doing at the Society. So at that point, actually, Professor William C. Dara took over. I think his daughter is here in the audience. And he became curator of the Society's museum collection for a time. And so I think we have a picture of him at some point in the slideshow. But this is actually an image from the original accession book that we still have that is in Fortenbaugh's hand. That was started in 1943. And as Tim mentioned, when we look through the book, it's really interesting sometimes because a lot of the donations were things we already had that they were now listing for the first time. So it's hard to know what we had and when we actually acquired it before 1943, when they first started entering things into the book. But they did start with 0001, and that was a 1776 50 shilling note, and we still have that in the collection. It's actually on display right now in the lobby of the bank in the square. So, yeah, we have a picture here of William Culp Dara, who was curator for a time and worked alongside Fortenbaugh and Glatfelter, very, very influential in the work that the Society was doing early on, and as well a very accomplished author and professor at the college. And then, of course, we have Dr. Charles Glatfelter. So let me talk just a little about him. I know you all knew him, but I'd like to do justice to this by going over a little bit of his biography. But he was born in Glen Rock, PA, and graduated from the college in 1946 in Gettysburg. And then he went off and got his PhD from Johns Hopkins in 1952. And he was actually already on the faculty by 1949 of Gettysburg College. And he would serve on the faculty till 1989. So talk about a long commitment of his life to the college and also to the Historical Society. He was first asked to come into the Society by Frederick Tilburg, who was another big name involved with the Society early on. He was in 1959. That was the first time Dr. G walked through the doors, or maybe he visited, but this was the first time he worked in an official capacity. And basically from 1959 until 2001, he was the effective leader of the Historical Society. So I don't think there's no one over the course of the Historical Society's history that put in more, I think, more time and effort and energy than he did virtually over his entire life. So he was first librarian, and then he was elected a vice president in 1960, or at least designated vice president. And then in 1962, he served for 2 years as president of the Society. Now, there's an important distinction here between, and especially now, between the board and the people who are actually in the building and running the building. And so Dr. Glatfelter, although he was only president of the Society for 2 years, was basically acting as its director for free for until I think 1970 something when he first was, I don't know, was he ever paid? I don't know. I'm not sure. But anyway, until he retired in 2001, he was basically the head of the society, and obviously it was an honor to work with him for a couple of years in his retirement. And we see his handwriting all over just about everything. And as Tim and I usually enjoy doing, we wanted to read a few things that he left behind. He was kind of the history police, as some of you know. If somebody said something that was a little inaccurate or a lot inaccurate, he had no problem sending them a letter, a very formal letter in only the way that he could do, that was full of very colorful commentary. So we'll just talk about a couple of these. This is the first one you may have seen if you have researched in our society reading room. The top one. This is a note that he placed in a lot of books and pamphlets. The Adams County Historical Society recommends that anyone using the material contained in this book seek reliable, independent, corroborating evidence before accepting statements made therein. And sometimes that would go with a big warning at the top with an exclamation mark. So he did a real service, I think, by doing this. I mean, he was the official county historian, actually designated that in 2001. So, I mean, it was his job to weed out the things that perhaps were not as accurate. And then this is another one that Tim pointed out to me in the last couple days that I really enjoy. It is to be expected that those whose minds are made up and who do not desire to be confused by the facts will continue to believe that Samuel White laid out what is now the town of Biglerville. So, I mean, stuff like that, we continue to have great joy reading things that he perhaps tucked away and didn't expect that people would find and keep finding over and over again. And Tim has a really funny story, too.
Yeah, I have a couple of them that I got out. I think the first time I really became aware of his notes was I was researching the founding of Hunterstown. Let me see if I have the Hunterstown letter here. And I think it was in the 1970s, 1978, that the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission was placing a plaque at the town of Hunterstown announcing that it was founded in 1741, or I think 1749 is what they had on it. And of course, Hunterstown's like 1764. So, we're talking about like, a little difference in years, 15 years or something like that. And he had a barrage of correspondence with the state historian at that time who was preparing the plaque. And there was a National Register form being filled out, and Dr. G was livid about the information in this form and how it was based on an unreliable source. So he wrote a lengthy letter, and then the state historian sent a letter back saying something like, there's a quote in here, I feel that the information in the National Register nomination is not false or misleading. And then he says in this last letter he wrote to her, if from the evidence presented in my letter of October 9th, you do not recognize the quoted material as false and misleading, then our standards of accuracy are so different as to make effective communication all but impossible. In speaking of his position at the Historical Society, we have two interesting documents that he wrote later in his life that tried to explain, who was in charge of the different facets of the Historical Society. And like I said, it's very complicated because the title of the person in charge of a committee or on the board of directors or in the archives changed as time went by to like librarian or archivist or director or executive associate director. And Dr. G had this to say about it. For many years, even after the move to Schmucker Hall, the actual responsibility for administering the Society's library, archival, and museum collections was discharged in a less than clearly defined fashion. So, he often was critical of the way, we were doing things or we were organizing things. And we're always reorganizing things. I think that's one thing that you'll learn about archivists, always reorganizing stuff. So obviously, and as I understand it, to make the story very, very simple, to make a long story short, the Adams County Historical Society was much more expansive than the courthouse had ever imagined we would become by the late 1950s. And they were looking for us to move on and find a location of our own. At the same time, the Lutheran Theological Seminary had this large dinosaur of a building that they just didn't know what to do with. And the Lutheran Seminary was toying with the idea as early as 1954 of tearing down the old dorm or Schmucker Hall. They were going to tear it down. And at some point, the Adams County Historical Society and its members and the Lutheran Theological Seminary's board realized that this might work in a joint venture. And the Adams County commissioners actually helped fund the renovation of the building and the move of the Adams County Historical Society from the basement of the courthouse to the Schmucker Hall on the Lutheran Seminary campus. And for many, 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 many years, things worked, really well together there. And I think the members of the Historical Society are still very proud of the fact that we are the ones that really helped to preserve the building and were committed to making the building survive, and continue to survive for many years. Now, when they got the big building, of course, now there was all this room for an expansive museum. So the collections that had been acquired, not just the library and the archive collections, but artifacts from the early county history were moved into a museum context. And Dr. G has written that the three most influential people, or the four most influential people in the early museum were William Kalpdara, George Olinger, Arthur Weiner, and Edith Ditchburn, who I could not find. I'm sure we have somewhere a photograph of her, but I was not able to find it. And they really were responsible for organizing and creating the museum. And also going through the register of artifacts during the move that we had and trying to determine if we had everything our register says we have. And I should mention, before we go on here, that we have the original accession register, which was started by Robert Fortenbaugh. And basically, in 1943, he went around when they were putting stuff in the courthouse and accessioned every item that we had. And it starts with the original 209 accessioned items in our collection. And I know some of the volunteers, I see Roger right over here probably gets annoyed with me. Every once in a while, I get out the book, and I'm trying to find those things because they're still marked with the number. And about half of the original things that we have, I have found and held in my hand and checked off in the book. That doesn't mean we don't have the other half, we probably do. It's just that we have such an expansive collection that, it's always a great pleasure for me when I come across one of these original 209 items and I can put that check in that column in my book.
Just briefly, because I want to get to what we want to talk about with being an old dorm. Arthur Weiner here on the right, I had the pleasure of organizing his vast collection of research that he did on properties in Adams County. But he was also a very talented sketch artist. And here he is another example of the history police at the Adams County Historical Society. The Fairfield Inn is one of those establishments that has perhaps exaggerated its history a few times over the course of the last 100 years. But this is a really neat sketch that I found that Arthur Weiner made of God himself dining outside on the seventh day of the Fairfield Inn. So just if you didn't think it was that old, but that's one of many sketches that he made that are now a part of our collection. And so now Tim's going to talk a little bit about the museum, and I'm sure many of you, if not maybe more than half of you, went through the museum at one point or another.
So when they laid out the museum, obviously they had a lot of artifacts that were originally donated to the society, but also it gave the opportunity for the society to receive large donations of furniture that they simply just could not accept when they were in the basement of the courthouse. And several families donated items to the Historical Society. And the original Historical Society had rooms that were not necessarily chronologically arranged, but just more names of rooms with collections in them. Like you might know, we had a coffin room, and a lot of it was donated by a gentleman from Fairfield whose family owned a mortuary business. This is the Henry Stort room in our original society. And Dr. Henry Stort, of course, was a member of the society until his death in 1956. And he had donated a lot of stuff, including, his bicycle, which can still be seen in the hallway as you go up the steps here over in the Wolf House. We had the Sarah Black room. Sarah Black had donated a bunch of stuff. And we had the Hill room. The Hill family had donated a large amount of material. In the 1990s, we actually hired a museum curator, Carol Kearney, she's right here, and she took apart the museum. I guess at the time, some people were a little miffed at what she did because she got rid of like the family rooms, like the Black room or the Stort room, and made it more chronologically thematic. So we had an early history room, and we had a Civil War room that came about, and so it was more arranged as a museum. And then we were able to have docents that would give tours of the museum to tell the whole story of Adams County history. And of course, I designed the Civil War room, and here's Andy Larson checking out and admiring my work, I think there, Andy. I knew he'd be here, so I put one in of him. Okay? And, one of the big problems was, since everyone was a volunteer, was keeping the place open for research. And reading Dr. Glatfelter's history of our archives, different people volunteered on different days at the courthouse. And then eventually, when we moved up here to Schmucker Hall, for a time, I think they were only open just on Wednesdays. And then eventually they expanded to Wednesdays and Saturdays. And then eventually it was Wednesdays and Fridays and Saturdays. And then, then Thursday nights. We just kept expanding our hours. But they hired some students at the Lutheran Theological Seminary to run the society during the 1960s, because Dr. Glatfelter was still, dean of the college and was an active professor at the college. But 1965, Elizabeth Tangen, came in.
Sorry.
Go back. And she was the one who, totally volunteer, no pay, who ran the society and ran the research facility. And the first time I came to the society, I don't know when the first time I was there, when we were talking about 1989, that's the first time that's when I started working for the society. But sometime in the 70s, I came here and I met her, and she helped me out. I'm sure many people in the room remember Mrs. Tangent. And she retired, and she lived for another 10 or so years after. I think she moved to Ohio after she ran the society. Okay. Now, of course, we had a large amount of volunteers that helped with the collection, and we still have volunteers today that have helped with the collection. But I just wanted to mention a couple, one guy in particular, J. William Long. And I tell you, I do not believe that I ever met J. William Long. Although our time at the society crossed over a little bit. I think maybe he just wasn't coming to the society as much. And he left Gettysburg in 1990. But when he died, Dr. G wrote a little tribute to him that was read at the society. As a member of the Adams County Historical Society, Bill Long compiled a record which will not be forgotten. When he asked me one day, and I think in 1965, what he could do that would be useful, I told him to begin with 1800 newspaper and copy out the notices of marriages and obituaries and sales notices, placing them on a 3x5 index card. Given the drudgery of such an assignment, I fully expected Bill to tire of it in a short time. He fooled me. In fact, most of the 100,000 cards in our personal files were prepared by Bill, who carried this project into the 1940s newspapers. Bill also prepared a brief history of most of the early churches in the county. They were long a very popular feature in our monthly newsletter. For the same publication, he wrote extensive accounts based on great deals of research of dozens of Adams County towns and villages. He investigated the successive owners of most of James Geddes' original 210 town lots, the results of which effort are in 3 heavily used notebooks on our shelves. And he goes on to talk about how every day in the society we pick up something that he contributed to. Now, Larry Bowen, volunteered at the Historical Society for many years, decided one day to challenge the number of cards in the cabinet. Dr. G had said 100,000 and we had kept that number for a long time. So he took a stack of cards, counted out like 100 of them, and then he figured out how many cards were in the cabinet. And there are not 100,000, there are 250,000 index cards in our cabinets, done by this man. Just an incredible amount of work. Some other volunteers I just wanted to throw in here that you probably know. And again, we can't talk about everybody, but and I knew so many people that have come and gone into society. Nancy Jean Hammett, who was once the owner of the Fairfield Inn, she operated the front desk for many years. So when he came into the Schmucker Hall, she'd be at the front desk and she would then send you where you needed to go. I was very, very fond of Thelma Bullitt. And she did a lot of work at the Society, organizing records and putting a lot of the newspaper clippings into the vertical files on various history topics. Lita Brown, and I was unaware of this when she worked there, started with us in her 90s. And she did not appear to me, she was very outgoing and very energetic for being in her mid-90s. She is the one who, when we first got a microfilm copier, copied all the death and marriages notices from 1800 until 1900 out of the newspaper and put them into binders for us. We found this photograph. We don't have many photographs of the society or our staff, because again, we're too busy doing other people's history and not our own. But here's a Christmas party in 1997, and I guess Woody and I are both battlefield tour guides. We're coming from the park. But eventually we did have, besides the volunteers, and of course here is Sarah Fuss, John's wife, and she was probably the person I was closest to in the society for many, many, many years, because before Roger and his wife came every Saturday, it was Sarah Fuss that worked with me every Saturday. But we did have a secretary, Cheryl Snyder, and she was, I believe, the first hired paid secretary for Dr. Glatfelter, and then after her was Jan Beebe, and of course now we have Althea Riley, and we had our museum curator for a while, and then we'll talk about that in a moment. But and then Randy Miller was sort of the part-time maintenance man. He's not the maintenance man anymore. But again, our structure of who was president or who was a museum curator or who was the librarian or the archivist is very complicated. But based on who we think is in charge of the board or the president of the society at any given time, Andrew put this list together.
Yeah, so fortunately Dr. Glatfelter made the list up until 1992, and then I just found the rest out. But it is interesting, we've had so many leaders of the society, leaders of the board, that is. On the earlier side of this, you can see that mostly the terms were 2 or 4 years or even 1 year. And toward the end, especially like George Olinger was president from 1964 until his death in 1991. So I think he's probably our longest serving chair of the board, or at the time it was referred to as a president of the society. Now it's chair of the board. This is another, we have a lot of really neat photos of donations to the society. This is one of our really cool, this is a David Sterner stove that we got. from a gentleman from Fairfield, Mr. Landis, who's still living in Fairfield, I believe. And that's Dr. Glatfelter accepting it. So like Tim said, we really didn't have the capacity to take large items when we were in the courthouse, and that all changed. And of course now, unfortunately, our large items are all out in storage, and we're hoping one day we can have a facility, hopefully sooner rather than later, where we can take all these things out and interpret them properly. So now we'll talk just a little bit more about the recent history, and then I just wanted to cover some of the challenges that Tim and I currently face with organizing and keeping the collection accessible and stored to the proper standard. But Russell Swody came in and after Dr. Glatfelter retired in 2001 and served for 4 years. He's in the center there. I'm sure you guys, well, you all probably know Wayne. Wayne Motz, who came to the Society in 2004. Was director until 2012 and is now at the Civil War Museum, National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg. But Wayne was very involved with the Seminary Museum project and then supervised our move to the Wolf House. And of course now we are at the Wolf House, built in 1883. And it is at the end of the seminary campus. And there are a lot of challenges that we are presented with, but also some opportunities. I mean, obviously being in an old house is a unique setting because of all the history that we're interpreting. To be in an old house is good, but it's also a drawback in terms of being able to control things like temperature, light, having fireproof doors and walls, which we do not have. So that's really an issue that we still face. And obviously having to organize boxes in rooms that were once, a closet or a bathroom or, a bedroom. It's not ideal for an archive as large as ours. And we do have over 1 million objects, artifacts, and documents in our collection. So it is a unique challenge that we face. And of course, our current director, Ben Neely, who I showed him, he was very happy that I was going to put this picture of him and Paul Giamatti in the show. Paul Giamatti visited the Society, I think in 2005, if I remember what he told me. Right, but that was a cool day for Ben because Ben at that time was collections manager and got to take him around. And we should note that during the filming of the movie Gettysburg, the actors and actresses were mainly actors, I suppose, visited the old dorm and shot some footage from the cupola, and except there was also a fake cupola, as some of you know. So Ben is our current director, and this is our current staff at the Wolf House, except Lauren, who just left us a couple years ago, and she's working in Baltimore now at a museum.
Let me mention something.
And yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and Andrew, I forgot, in one photograph I showed of the staff, I forgot to point out Woody Christ. You probably saw Woody Christ in there, and we didn't want to leave him out. He was assistant director for many years under Dr. Glatfelter and was really the person who started to get our museum collection out of just the register and put it onto some kind of computer system.
Yeah, so I also wanted to put this slide up. This is, it's relatively few people have been basically in charge of the collection over the Society's time. Robert Wharton obviously early on, and as we talked about, it was really until 2001 that someone other than Dr. Glatfelter was in charge of what we were accepting, how we were recording the donations, and as you can see, it's now to us. It's our task to complete during the day. So I wanted to talk about some of the challenges in the building and what projects we've completed since we moved into the Wolf House, and what we're trying to do moving forward to make the Society more accessible and have things stored properly and in efficient order. So there's 2 projects here I wanted to highlight. On the left is our genealogical books. So there we have tons and tons of family histories, as some of you know from researching at the Society. And one big thing we did was separate the books from all the binders that used to sit in the room. And so we stripped everything out of binders, which destroys the record over time, and put them into boxes. And that was a major improvement, and we've really invested a lot in archival supplies over the past 4 years to make sure that everything is being safely preserved. And then also I should mention we have probably, I would say, next to the Park Service Library, one of the most comprehensive libraries of books on the Battle of Gettysburg. And one of our dedicated volunteers, Megan Eppelman, has been working on tagging all of the books properly with the official Library of Congress number. So our library is actually really better organized than it ever has been. And that's been an effort since we established the Civil War Room in the early 2000s. And a couple other things I just wanted to highlight. We have an amazing index we actually have all of the estate files in Adams County from 1800 until the 1960s, I think, or is it 50s?
1980s, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. We store the other ones off-site. But, and we just recently completed an index of every single estate file, which was thousands and thousands of names. So now we have a full searchable index of whose estate papers we have, which includes wills, inventories, sales, all kinds of stuff like that. And then also, something that was done early on was the photographs in the collection were actually separated and put in a specific collection called ACHS photographs. Now today we wouldn't have done that because, and I'll explain in a minute why, we're really concerned now with keeping things in the order that they arrived in. So in other words, if someone donated a box of stuff to us, whereas 30 years ago it made sense to take that apart and put certain things in certain files and put the photos with the in the photo room, put the documents in the vertical file, put objects in the object room, put, if something was a pamphlet, you'd put it on the shelf. But now today, the problem with that obviously is if someone came in 10 years later and said, my grandmother gave you guys a box of stuff, like, can I see it? It's a challenge would have been a challenge for us to reassemble that stuff. So what we do now is when we receive something, we go to all ends to keep those materials together as a unique donation. And with the computer, we have software that enables us to enter the location of these items and give a great summary of what it is. So now we're able to keep things together and also have them accessible through our software that we use that I'll mention in a minute. We also have large items, and we just bought a gun rack for our rifles. We have a flintlock musket, which is really neat. But I'm sure some of you saw some of this stuff in the old museum. And I mean, it's a challenge with larger items. We have flat storage, and we just recently reorganized all of our flat storage by accession number. So that was putting it back with the things that it arrived in the building with. And we have an index. It's all being entered into the computer now by really great volunteers who are working on it. So I just wanted to briefly explain, this has been the process for a long time and it still is in all repositories, to keep track of who gave you what and when it was given. And as I said earlier, the reason for that is because everything that came in the door together, 95% of the time at least, is uniquely related. And so separating it takes away the context. So in other words, we've found a photograph here and a letter written by the person in the photograph in a totally different place, and we had no idea that the two things were together. And the story that they tell when we reunite it is really valuable. So an accession, early on we gave accession numbers by number. We started with 1 and we went all the way to 8,934. And then in 2001 we switched to the current practice, which is using the year as part of the accession number. So the first donation that came in 2001 got that number, 2001.001. And then what happens is every item within that donation is entered into the computer so that we can find it. And that's called cataloging. And that's what you see Joey in here. I took her picture today. I don't know if she knows that I took her picture. But there she is cataloging records into our software, which is called Past Perfect. And this is the software. We got it in the early 2000s. And it is incredible. It is the future of museums and archives is this. It is being able to type in any keyword you could think of and seeing a list of 1 to 100 or 200 or 300 things that include that word. So if you wanted to search Gettysburg Electric Railway, you could do that, and you'd find pictures, documents, anything. So that's what we still use. And through the course of this reorganization, Tim and I have found some really, really unique things that were kind of tucked away in a place where we wouldn't think to look. This here is a booklet written by John Quincy Adams and signed by John Quincy Adams at the top. He wrote this about Marquis de Lafayette, and we had it in our Lafayette family file because everybody comes into the Historical Society to research Marquis de Lafayette. So I guess since no one ever has done that, we never opened the file and never knew that we had that until about a month ago. And then on the right is something I found, and I don't think I can ever find anything more interesting than that. It is an original program from the Gettysburg Address. It was in an unlabeled box in an unlabeled folder with other papers. So this is the nature of county historical societies. In a place like Gettysburg, you never know if you're going to be looking at something like that or just someone's diary from the 18th, 19th century. Whoops, went backwards. And then I put some statistics here. So currently we have 10,604 accessions. So that's 10,000 donations to the society since 1940. And in recent years, we've taken in about 100 per year. And right now we have 49,536 records are cataloged into our computer software. So that's when you search at our society, you're searching 49,000 records, which is really incredible. And since we have over 1 million, we have a long, long, long way to go. But this really is the future of finding things. And in 2016, we had just over 900 members from 40 of the 50 states, including Alaska and Hawaii. And this is our 78th year since the incorporation in 1940. So, and then finally, and then I'll let Tim talk about, I've stolen the mic from him a little, we weren't supposed to show that yet. This is actually a map of our membership that we created recently to see where the people live who are supporting us, and we rely on those members for everything we do, contributions, people visiting, and we try so hard to help anybody who comes through the door, as well as try really hard to get the building into a better organization so that we can easily find things for people when they come in, because that's what it's all about. And then this is a blow-up of Adams County. So it's a pleasure for me to work there, because you really never know when you walk in the door what you might find that day, because the things have been tucked away and carefully by volunteers 30, 40 years ago who put things carefully in a folder, and it's up to us to take that and put that information out on a computer, on our website. You can search now all of our photos on our website. So it's just really valuable, and I think all history kind of goes back to the local level, and that's why it's really a great privilege to work here and learn more about what we do.
Oh, I don't know if I had anything to add. I was wondering, we are a little light, on members on Hunterstown, and besides Roger,
it was
who's
that
the
letter.
other member in Mount Tabor up there, Roger? Oh, so got a couple members there, so you might be able to see yourself on the map. We were just going to say with the next slide that, obviously, the temporary, our Wolf House is meant to be a temporary place for the society. For many years, we were in the old dorm of the seminary, and I'm sure you're familiar with the project to renovate that building and turn it into a museum. And of course, eventually we're looking at a permanent home, and we're not sure exactly how long that'll take, but my vision is something like this for the next historical society. And I'm sure in a few years we're going to have a new building, and the research facility is better than ever at the moment at the Wolf House. It's expansive. We have access to a large amount of our records. So if you're doing research, the Wolf House is actually a vast improvement on Schmucker Hall. But the museum collection is currently in storage, and it won't be until we get a new facility that we can bring the museum collection and a research facility and hopefully the monthly meeting to one building in one place. Something that the Historical Society has really never had. I don't know if some of you, I'm sure some of you have, like me, were at meetings in the basement of Schmucker Hall that never was quite that nice like the auditorium that the seminary provides for us. So we're looking forward to that in the future. But I think that's all we had tonight.
Yep.
Let's thank Tim and Andrew.
I hope you enjoyed this evening's, because you cannot push forward unless you know exactly where you came from. And we formed a basis tonight of what the Adams County Historical Society history, where it came from, people who formed it, and now we're going to be working on new directions, showing the people who make up Adams County. Next month, we'll be partnering with Gettysburg College, and we will have a panel discussion on the Black experience over 200 years in Adams County. We have Professor Scott Hancock moderating. We have Professor Peter Levy coming in from York College, who will be one of our featured speakers. We have other featured speakers, and we're going to be looking at doing something major like this every year. As I look out over the people here, you are part of our history. Each and every one of you belong to organizations, belong to churches, live in towns that make up the history of Adams County, and we want to encompass that. This year we're going to be working in partnership not only with the colleges, but also with the Gettysburg Foundation. We're going to piggyback with the National Park Service with activities. So 2 or 3 times we're going to be off-site doing things. We'll be doing a walking tour of the National Cemetery of featured members of Adams County who are buried there. We will be doing a visit to the Rupp House History Center owned by the Gettysburg Foundation. But it's not only about the Rupp House, it's going to be talking about the leading into the Civil War with all the people in Adams County, and also the aftermath and how it affected everybody here. And I want to thank everybody that's been working with us, Ron, Mike, Bob, Jane, to try to put together the best package of events that we could possibly have. We're looking to work with all the local historical societies. We want to promote them. How many of you are also members of our local town historical societies? Excellent. We want to encourage that, and we want to see if we can partner with other organizations and work together for a common goal of presenting what the amazing things that we have here in the county.
Okay, so with that said, does anyone have any questions about the society or thoughts on anything, or wanted to? I'm sure somebody wants to point out someone that we didn't talk about that played a critical role in the society. No, you may. Any questions? Or you may come up and ask us questions privately here at the end of the program. But I want to thank everybody, and we hope to see you here next month or there next month at our other location, which you can get directions for. Okay, thank you.